Hello and welcome to TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guest on this next interview. Now, Russia's latest mass strike on Kyiv has sharpened questions over Ukraine's air defenses, Russia's defense production, and Moscow's widening hybrid campaign against Europe. Ahead of the NATO meeting in Ankara, allies faces pressure to move faster on interceptors, counter-drone systems, as well as sanctions enforcement. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss all of this is Joshua Burgin, founder of the Alliance for Global Security. His work focuses on international security, defense policy, as well as strategic threats facing Europe and the world. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good evening, Ben. Nice to be with you tonight.
So first of all, happy 4th of July. And going into this particular topic, now Russia does appear to still be able to sustain record-sized drone and missile attack despite all the sanctions and talks of reports of struggling economy as well. What does that tell us about the resilience of its defense industrial base?
Well, I see Russia right now as thrashing. The degree to which Ukraine has been able to land incredible blows on their energy infrastructure, Russia's reeling and attempting to send a signal, likely both to the Ukrainians, but also sort of blunt instrument signaling ahead of the NATO convening in Ankara in just a few days. The notion that Ukraine is absolutely pushing back, has developed all sorts of from the field drone responses. Clearly, they need assistance in building some of their anti-drone drones at scale.
Right. So speaking of that thrashing by Russia, do you think that it is something calculated, like you mentioned, ahead of NATO to try to influence some decision making, or do you think it's more out of a desperation as they are really running out of options?
I think they are legitimately running out of options, but I mean, this is a classic playbook of the Kremlin to go ahead and saber-rattle to create uncertainty amongst delegates to a convening that should be focused on a specific agenda. Russia's trying to alter the agenda, in my view.
Right. Do you think it's going to be effective to throw a wrench into the agenda, or do you think that things are still going to kind of move forward as it's supposed to?
Well, I mean, if we look at it substantively, and I do not want to in any way sound as though I'm diminishing the value of human life, because I'm not. The intentional attacks on civilians, and frankly, the fact that the West has tolerated this so long is somewhat intolerable. This said, it's quite clear to me that the blows that Ukraine has been landing practically day after day for the past few weeks, with the diminishment of energy production. I mean, Russia's literally having to export crude oil in order to get refined fuels back. This is a pretty unthinkable thing just a couple of years ago, and it is putting, I think, Russia on the ropes as the public is legitimately feeling this. They're not able to fuel up their cars. The fuel qualities they are getting are diminishing or damaging their cars. Clearly, this is creating pressure on Moscow that has not existed heretofore.
Right. So when it comes to this upcoming NATO meeting, do you think any countries will be intimidated by these sort of strikes and these saber rattling? And do you think that it will be able to alter any kind of decision making?
Honestly, I don't believe it will. I mean, clearly they're attempting to adjust the frame. Whether it does so is I think it's unlikely. We're seeing an increased awareness and level of interest. Obviously, we're seeing a delegation from Indo-Pacific countries coming in for this particular fora. Obviously, the President of the United States will be present for both engagement with NATO member country partners as well, and likely some bilats. I don't see Russia as having influence other than this rabid dog is getting on people's nerves, and it's probably getting ever closer to time to put it down.
Right. Now, there are also some reports that Russia is using elements of the shadow fleet to support drone operations. If this is accurate, does this represent a significant evolution in terms of this hybrid warfare? And should we start considering these as active warfare and just kind of drop the hybrid language?
The fact that it's taken them so long to use this particular platform to launch drones is surprising. I don't see this as a significant shift. What I do see is the notion that Europe itself, while it has historically sort of fragmented its coastal patrols, needs to consider some efforts to consolidate in a way that would enable Europe to put forth a coast guard that has legitimate enforcement and policing capabilities. We might stop short of warships, but nevertheless, the very fact that these ships continue to come and go from Russia virtually unimpeded is I think, a signal to just some of the level of investment engagement that Europe needs to engage in terms of countering Russia. I'm kind of looking at some of that, the very fact that the territorial waters are sort of under each individual country state, the sort of limitations on what that policing action can be on each level, the fact that there's something holistic, perhaps it's time to consider doing that, to be again stopping and arresting some of these vehicles.
Right, and President Zelensky has recently also urged international partners to kind of see these shadow fleet as legitimate targets. Do you think that means that Ukraine will soon be taking action against it? And what kind of international complications do you think that this might incur?
I mean, everything we've seen thus far is that Russia bloviates and makes a lot of noise, saber-rattles, every time something of strategic is suggested as a new target. But when it comes down to it, they don't do very much. To that end, I'm kind of shocked as to the fact that we haven't seen nation state, Western country interdictions of these vehicles. The notion that Ukraine has the capacity, the fact they haven't already gone to do so to take out some of the shadow fleet. There have been fits and starts. The notion that it is time to do so with earnest and gusto, taking more of that infrastructure off the table for Russia, I think it's well past time.
Back to these strikes that we're looking at on the screen right now. We've seen some of the largest strikes targeting the Ukrainian capital over the past couple of days. Again, this is coming from the backdrop of reports about the dwindling Russian economies and all the sanctions and stuff. Do you think that Russia actually found a sustainable way to keep these strikes up? Or do you think that this thrashing is ahead of the NATO summit and they are trying to kind of throw everything at the wall before the meeting? Do you think they'll eventually run out of gas?
I've seen nothing so far that says that they're scaling up production of anything. Mm-hmm. Everything does seem to be sort of tapering or flatlined. I firmly believe that this is a moment in which they're attempting to throw as much as they can against the wall. We've seen these escalations before. Let's think back to when Putin visited the president of the United States in Alaska. There was all sorts of escalation and attacks, civilian casualties. I think we're seeing something from the operational playbook more than a substantive signal of either increased abilities for production or really that they're scraping the bottom of the barrel. I think they're just reverting to mean in many ways.
Yeah. Now, going back to the upcoming NATO meeting, what simple capability do you think the allies should prioritize this time around if they want to materially change Ukraine's defensive operations and their position over the next 6 to 12 months?
At the end of the day, everything hinges on the economy, the notion of offensive weapons, but the notion of these cross-border strikes that have granted so much to Ukraine. I can understand how Europe itself, NATO member countries, would not wish to be directly party to that. But I certainly think it is absolutely in everyone's interest to scale up our abilities to provide to Ukraine more defensive anti-drone technology. I've been saying for a long time, and you've heard me say it on the show, Ben, the idea that it is well past time for European troops to be in theater in Ukraine, perhaps not on the very front line or certainly no cross-border, but being part of the efforts to minimize Russia's efforts, hardening up the forces so they have experience, are engaged in triage, supply chain. Everything that's happening on that front lines is creating a very effective force for Ukraine, and Europeans could benefit both by supporting but also experiencing some of that as well.
All right, very important, but we're not seeing a lot of European leaders actually taking that action, as you mentioned. We've heard also repeated calls for more air defense system, drone defense system as well. What do you think the bottleneck is? Is there a production thing? Is it a supply chain? Are we talking about the lack of launchers or even just political will or economic concerns?
In candor, Ben, I think in many cases political will is the core element that's lacking. Political will that's rooted in personnel that are supposed to make policy decisions that don't have military experience, that don't truly understand how the Russians function and operate. Political will lacks from an audience that is almost always cowed into concern when Russia engages in saber rattling, as opposed to coming forward and saying, Russia, we'll debate whether you're going to continue to exist with the current territories you have once you've surrendered. It is time for this to be over. Even some of the calls for, I don't see public calls to Russian elites to end Putin's leadership. It is well past time for these sorts of calls. This is not good for Russia. It is not good for Ukraine. It is decidedly not good for Europe or, frankly, the rest of the world.
Is there any way that Ukraine or even its allies or organizations like the ones you establish yourself can help make that advocate to perhaps get things rolling, push things forward, or change some of that political calculus to shed light on how important it actually is, not just for Ukraine, but for collective defense?
Man, I could make that call every single day, as almost any other think tanker could, and we'd have about 1,500 to 3,000 people around the world paying attention. It's going to require someone with political leadership and legitimacy. Frankly speaking, the President of the United States could make the same call, but it wouldn't hurt for the President of the United States, von der Leyen, the President of Germany, any one of the senior presidents saying, okay, folks, this period is done. Our patience is over. It is time for Putin to end. Exit stage right or stage left. Q Swan Lake. Frankly, I think Russians at this point, no matter what's happening internally, we've all seen the headline this week that Putin has expanded his security forces yet again to nearly 1,000 people. Means 1,000 people to protect one guy. Says that his lease on power and perhaps even life is coming to an end. The West could do much, I think, to begin to nudge that without alienating or causing suspicions or additional supports within the Russian populace. They too can see the writing on the wall.
Right. So where do you think things go from there? Is there a possibility where some of the oligarchs around Putin would revolt against him? Is there a sort of a power structure change if Ukrainian strikes continue and they still continue to meet economic turmoil and fuel crisis?
At this point, the way that the fuels are impacting the general public, I think you're starting to see beyond just the oligarch. It's not just the circle of 18 or 50. It's starting to be the general public. Something that Putin worked really hard to immunize them from for a long time, protecting the sons and daughters of St. Petersburg, the sons and daughters of Moscow, turning indeed to indigenous people and smaller population groups that aren't at the center of sort of the Russian power, choosing first to go after their sons and daughters first as cannon fodder. This pain that they're feeling, you're seeing the responses in social media posts from many Russians who are suddenly feeling what their Ukrainian brothers and sisters have been feeling for many, many months, if not years. I just don't see there being a long window of time. And I will point to at issue an illustration granted to me by someone within that society many years ago around what caused Chechnya to come to an end. And the word in that moment was Nordlist.
All right, so we'll have to see how that develops. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight, Josh. I really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TPP World.
Great to be with you this evening, Ben. Have a good evening.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TPP World.